Thank you for joining us today and for this leadership forum featuring our Young Leader Award recipient, Hilda McClure. Our theme is Empowering Wellness, and we're exploring the importance of centering self-care and wellness with women, especially women of color. I'm Mary Valadez. I'm the Associate Vice President for Grants here at the Texas Women's Foundation. And before we start, a few housekeeping pieces. One is that this session is being recorded, and it will be available for all the attendees to watch after the event. So you'll receive a link, and you can watch this and any of the other conversations that we're having. Also, we'll have some time for questions and answers, so be thinking about those questions as we go through. So, now I'd like to introduce our Young Leader Award recipient, Hilda McClure. Hilda, COO at Conenta Center for Healing and Empowerment and a founding board member at Conenta Foundation, is a skilled, bilingual, licensed professional counselor specializing in adult therapy and trauma-focused counseling. Driven by dedication to youth well-being, she pioneered an evidence-based program for children and single mothers in residential care. As a grant maker, committed to community growth, she trains professionals in serving Hispanic families and navigating the acculturation process. Our forum moderator is supporter and philanthropic partner, Kim Cummings. Kim serves as the Senior Vice President of Employee Experience for Children's Health Dallas. In this role, Kim leads human resources, talent strategy, and talent initiatives for Children's Health Dallas campus and service area. She has spent her career championing diversity and inclusion in human resources for many companies across the nation. As a member of both the H100 Giving Circle at Texas Women's Foundation and the Orchid Giving Circle, Kim understands the power of collective giving by pooling resources to support programs and services that uplift Latin and Asian communities across North Texas. Kim, we appreciate you being here to moderate this thoughtful conversation about advancing women leaders.
Well, hello, and thank you for being here today. So one of the questions that I'll start with is actually for me. Why do you come to these types of events? And when you think about the power of wellness and the definition of wellness, for the purposes of this conversation, wellness is going to be about well-being, so the overall impact of well-being. But when we think about two things, when we think about attending these types of events, we want to get something out of it, right? You want to learn from the speakers and the folks that are there. But you also want to network, and you want to find your people. So you're assuming that the people that attend these types of events are actually interested in the topic at hand. Is that right? Right. So I want you to do me a favor. I want you to look to the left and the right, and I want you to meet the person that's sitting next to you, if you don't already know them. And I want you just for a second to meet someone you don't know. Let's do that. Because you come to these events and you never really meet each other, kind of awkward, all the things. Okay, I've got some chatterers in the room. Let's bring it back to center. Let's bring it back. I always love to start our conversations that way because it is kind of a lonely place. When you come to these events, you know, you typically end up meeting somebody that you didn't know before, but in the purpose of coming to these events, it's about that. But the purpose of today's conversation and with Hilda is really to show that empowerment, so the wellness empowerment. So I want to dive into the questions and give y'all an opportunity to really think about the questions that you're going to ask her later, because while we have her, we want to ask her all of those impactful questions. Now, I'm not going to go into her bio because you're going to hear more about that this evening, but Hilda, tell us something here. So when you think about how you started off and your leadership journey, leadership not so much as how you rose in the career ranks, but specifically the skill sets that take you to leadership. Elaborate more on your path.
Absolutely. So I actually began my career in education. So I was a teacher for a very brief 1 year. And right, so much of education is actually leadership, right? In the classroom, learning how to manage and to manage feelings, even with the littles, right? Like just managing the feelings and the dynamic. And I think that was the start of that. And as 6 weeks into my first teaching job, I realized this is not for me. And so it began my career as a therapist. And so I went to grad school, and while I was in grad school, I was working at a church, and I led their sports ministry for kids. We had one of the largest in the area of that time. And I think for me personally, what ended up happening was that we're in the South, right? Churches can be very conservative about female leadership. But I had a really incredible boss, Randy, who saw my gifts and gave me every opportunity to use them, and if not, call them out. And I think that's kind of where it started, where I really could see myself as not just someone who worked behind the scene, but someone who had gifts and talents to lead in whatever capacity, right? And so from there, graduated, and I became a therapist. And what's kind of interesting about the therapy world is that you really do have to create a niche for yourself, because so much of the work is done in secret, behind closed doors. And part of that is just using what I used back at that church job, right, to network and to create that niche for myself.
I think it is important to find that niche, but for you, I think that we talked about this earlier. Like, should you just wake up one morning and say, hey, I'm going to solve world peace. I'm going to help people in the aspects of all things well-being, and specifically mental health. And I find that so inspiring, because nowadays, it's like, what do I want to do with my life? What do I want to be when I grow up? So, half of my world, my father, his family immigrated from Mexico. So when I think about my Latina culture and my heritage, and growing up in that space of you don't ask questions, you have issues, we're going to keep it within the family. So how do you break out of that taboo as you're helping women of color, and specifically Latinas?
It starts with me, right? I knew I wanted to serve women and girls from a very young age. And part of that is I think has always been an invitation in my home, with my family, in my marriage, to do my own work around that first. And there was, even though I grew up in Puerto Rico, very traditional Hispanic culture, my home my parents never forced me into cultural norms, and I think there was always space for me to explore what it looks like to not follow the trend. And so as I dive into this work, my goal is that I can offer an invitation to at least talk about it. Maybe we don't talk about the taboo stuff, but can I create a safe space around, hey, this thing is hard. We don't have to talk about the cultural dynamics around that, but can we just talk about that this is hard? And if I can model it and be authentic to myself, I think there's something, people are attracted to that. People are attracted to authenticity. We live in such an interesting world right now with social media and the comparison game, and I think what most people come back to is authenticity. And if I can embody that through my work, through my inner work, not just like my therapy work, but my inner work as a person, I think that has opened doors for me within my own culture to say, like, hey, I've been there, I know, and there's invitation here for us to play with something different.
So not only are you being recognized today, but I believe there are some special people in the audience that also support you. So how has your family influenced you in this decision to help others?
Yeah. My parents, my mom's here, and my godmother, and my parents have always been, I'm going to cry, oh my God. Thank you. My parents have always been so generous. We would have holidays and strangers would show up at our home because my dad met someone who didn't have a place to celebrate. And so, like, I learned it from them, right? That our lives are in service of others. Like, how do we love well? We serve where we can. And they've always allowed me to do that. They modeled it, and then they've always given me space to just explore. Like, there was never any expectation to be a certain kind of way. They always allowed me to be whoever I was, even, right? Like, I was still a teenager at one point. Even if that caused maybe some conflict in the home, it was never at the expense of myself. And so I learned it from them first, like, how can I be a good steward of what I've been given, whether that's more intrinsic in terms of giftings or opportunities, but also with the material. What is with my money, with my home, with my car, with my time. Yes. And so it really was them who just modeled it for me.
That's amazing, and the balance of love, and I know your hubby's in the audience as well, front row, which is amazing, by the way. So well, many of us are just thinking about what we're going to have for dinner and all the things that happened above that, but you're also an author. Like, you have written a book. So when you think about what you do and focusing on mental health and having those very difficult conversations, tell us how you've used advocacy to help you with your authorship.
Absolutely. I think when we talk about mental health, we have to talk about accessibility. And so that doesn't just mean finances, but that's actually even accessibility to get into the counseling room, to talk about the hard subjects. Our brain does this really funky thing that it will always go to the most accessible thing. So when you make an opinion or when you make a first impression, the first thing it thinks about is what's accessible. So that's why we make assumptions, because that's what's easily accessible. And so for mental health, we have to kind of use the brain, like, work together, and authorship and books make mental health more accessible. You don't have to talk to a therapist to do some inner work.
Yeah, it's like doing your homework. There are things about you that only you know. So why would you want others to tell you that? Like, you can't. You have all the answers. It's just, how do you find someone like you that helps bring that goodness out?
Yeah,
I love that. So when you dig a little bit deeper on this concept of leadership, what are some things you would tell your younger self, the younger generation? I talk about younger, she's like super young here, the Young Leader awardee. So tell us what you would tell the young population today.
To just start. I think I waited a long time for perfection, to know all the things, to be the expert in things, to just to know everything. And the reality is, you just have to start. Leadership is not it can be a C-suite, but leadership starts with yourself. Like, how do you lead yourself, and how do you start? And I think that if I was my younger self, I would have just told her, like, hey, just get started. Just whatever it is that you're wanting to do, just start. You don't have to be perfect. You don't have to always get it right. Just start.
I want to go back to your book. Tell us about how you got to the title of your book.
Yeah. So the title of the book is called Self-Care for Chingonas. And chingonas, we are reclaiming that word, right?
I think you need to explain what that is.
Yeah.
Because it's a really awesome word.
Yeah.
And I'm going to throw it in a conversation at work.
Yeah. So I do need to preface that. I'm not Mexican, I'm Puerto Rican. So we use chingona in a very different kind of way. But it used to be derogatory towards women. And so there has been a movement of help me out here, revitalizing it.
Yes.
Yep. And so we can also say it's like badass, like self-care for badass women. Yes. Yeah. And so part of wellness and why we're talking about empowerment is it starts with self-care. Yes. It starts with self-care. And for us to be the badass women we need to make sure that we are like giving to ourselves first. And in the book, we do that with culture, not just like kind of like the bubble baths you see on Instagram, but really about how do we take our own culture, things that have inherently been passed down to us as ways to self-care and pour back into ourselves.
I love that, especially when you have many generations who are coming to the U.S. and don't necessarily get to see the impact of their culture being played out. So self-care, we could all go down the rows and ask folks what they do for self-care, but specifically give us your top 2 or 3.
Okay. movement. So waking up and working out, any kind of movement really. Time with my family, with my husband. I personally need a lot of quiet time. So whether that's reading or watching TV, hobbies, like I like to just dabble in things. I have like, I want to make these Puerto Rican pastries, so I have like that in the back of my mind. But so that's where I start. Yeah. That's where I start. In my chapter in my book, I write a lot about living according to values, as self-care is important to me. So if I value authenticity, how do I make choices in alignment to that? And as I make those choices, that actually fills me up.
You know, earlier today I was talking to a group about intersectionality and how each of us have different identities that make us unique in who we are. And so you mentioned something about values and doing your homework. So each and every one of us in this room, and I'm probably preaching to the choir, but when you think about values and where you stand on certain aspects of things that are going on in the world and what you invest your time in, how do you find what those values are? Like, how do you coach other females around how to find those values? And what if they conflict? Because I get that a lot.
There will be conflict because we have a lot of values around a lot of different things. I usually start with what brings you the most joy? What are those, if you could think back in time at those moments where you felt like the most yourself, or you were like, man, this is like almost like an out of body, really wonderful experience. What was it about that thing? So I love training, I love teaching, it's always been, and so some of the highlights of my life is when I can get into a really good conversation with someone and there's like meat, and so for me, right, being able to pass information on is a value for me. And so we start with that. We also can start with conflict, right? So whether that's with your spouse or with your parents or your friends, and what is it, right? It's never about the thing. It's never about the thing. It's always about something else. If you can kind of get to the little bit more of a granular level of what is underneath that, that will indicate value. So it might be you value independence, right? And so when you're at work and your boss is breathing down your neck about something, and you're like, why does this bother me? So-and-so, they feel fine, they feel fine being told what to do, right? So some of that conflict, if you can kind of keep asking why, can also lead you to that granular level of values.
So I've often heard that journaling helps. And you
Yes.
being an author, I'm sure you'll say, go out and buy the best journal and start journaling. But what do you do with it after?
Sometimes you don't have to do anything. So the research shows that just being able to process in that kind of way the brain works, the writing, actually brings clarification. Because anyone guilty of overthinking? Yeah, thank you. Yeah, we can get trapped. And so journaling kind of gives us like that space to say, oh, wait a minute, this is different. And I tell my clients, we don't have to do anything with that. Feelings come and go, right? Today, you could have woke up and had someone cut you off and you're in a bad mood for 45 minutes, and then you have lunch with a friend and you're great. So what happened to the anger, right? And so journaling can just be a really great place to let it land. It can lead to discovery, but sometimes it's just like, I'm just gonna let this be here so it's not in me, and then I can have clarity.
So the Texas Women's Foundation brings like-minded individuals together who are passionate advocates for the work ahead of us. They build compelling visions. They interlocked in the mission of uplifting each other, empowering young girls and women's and everything around that aspect. So when you think about like your foundation, why did you create it? Why did you found it? Like, why should it be important for us to know more about your foundation?
Yeah, absolutely. So Canenta Foundation exists to make mental health accessible, particularly for the Hispanic community. Wellness should not be a privilege. It should be a basic starting thing. Everything we are stems from mental health, right? We like to categorize it into things, but physical health is mental health. Emotional health is mental health. Social health, the way we interact with our friends, is mental health. And for our community, for my community, where it still remains taboo, if someone's ready, we want them to walk through our doors, and we don't ever want cost to be a factor. And so that is one part of the work we do at the foundation, is we have $10 sessions for anyone who's ready for healing to come on board. The second part of the work we do is for our bilingual therapist. What we've seen in the work is that our bilingual peers, social workers or LPCs, there's a couple different, aren't passing at the same rate as our monolingual peers, which means that we actually have less people in the field to serve this community. And so our second project, Project Adelante, we help bilingual clinicians get to licensure. To take the test is $250 if you pass the first time. If you're not passing, $1,500, and you still don't have licensure, aren't making a living wage. And so part of our work is to elevate those clinicians, to help them get to licensure, and then even further past that is elevating them to find their niche. So any opportunity that we ever have for our clinicians, we're going to offer. We are very much committed to, as we rise, we bring along. And so that's the second part of the work.
So the empowering wellness, and when I think about just at Children's with translation services and knowing that I'm bringing the most precious of precious into an establishment to get help and support, knowing that the person on the other side understands my language, my culture, and why I'm there. So that's very impactful. I'm going to ask you one last question before we throw it to the beautiful audience out there. So you're about to get an award for Young Leader.
It's kind of wild.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's amazing. And you've just started. Like, your trajectory, you're going to be amazing. We're going to be reading about you in another year, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years. I'm going to be on my couch retired, and I'm going to still hear about your wonderfulness. What does it mean to win the Young Leader Award?
Oof, goosebumps. There's a lot of gratitude. So much of my work is done in the secret. There will be stories I carry that will go to my grave with me. And so to be honored in this way kind of recognizes that the work I'm doing, I don't know, really, that's not really super, but it's just like the work that I'm doing in secret, like, it's making such an impact that generations are changing because of that. And I think that's what this represents. Is it's not even like it's a stepping stool of like, hey, what you're doing is working. How do I continue to steward well, and how do I continue to like blaze paths, not just for me, but like my daughters, my granddaughters, my friends' kids, to serve their right. Like this award comes from a place of service, which is kind of odd. Why, but it has been the most meaningful work of my life, and to be honored in this way, just there's not really enough words for that.
Well, I want you to know, thank you. I know my daughter and my son, as they grow up, having someone who can help them in their journey is amazing.
Thank you.
And knowing that you have others who are just like you, that you are developing and growing into these leaders, is just so impactful. And when I think about that, as a mom, that's amazing.
Thank you.
Thank you for the work that you're doing. All right, questions?
That was amazing. Can we have another round of applause? So we have some time for questions and answers. So if you have a question, if you would raise your hand, and I will bring the microphone over to you. And to start off with, I have a question, and as we started with the introductions, and just residential care. How did you end up in that arena?
In residential care. So I was working at a church. I did that actually all the way through undergrad, quit, went back in grad school. But as I was getting deeper into my grad school work, I realized that I needed to be using what I was learning. And even though that was a great job and I learned so much, I needed something around what I was studying. And so there was like a random job posting on my grad school job board, and it was for the role was called Student Enrichment Coordinator. And they wanted me to come in and build a program around how to serve these kiddos. And I started my career with kids, right? Like I was in education, I did kids sports ministry. And it actually, to be honest, that is what changed my trajectory in my field, because it became all about trauma and I became obsessed. I was like, I have to know all the things. But it was great. The nonprofit I worked at wasn't residential care in the most traditional sense of the word. So there was single women and their kiddos, and the program was to get them to living wage. So they came in, worked on their trauma. We provided housing and food and job opportunities and education and training, so that when they were done, that they could never come back to us, right? That they could live empowered and free and self-sufficient. Mm-hmm. So kind of random, but it was good. For
me, it's full circle, because those are the things that we fund, and when I hear you say that, it's just a full circle. So I know we have some questions. If you will raise your hand. You have one here.
Thank you so much for sharing, and congratulations.
Thank you.
Awesome job moderating, Kim. How can we in the audience who represent the business community, I work at SMU in the Cox School of Business, how can we help you in the work that you're doing? How can we advocate and elevate the work that you're doing, so you can provide more to the community that you're serving?
Oh, that's a great question. Thank you. I'm going to be blunt. It's just money, right? Like, that's what it is, right? So if I were to kind of break it down for you, our sessions cost $10 for for the people that come in. But in order for us to provide the therapist, we have to provide supervision to make sure that there's accountability for them. And so supervisors do need to be paid their rate, right? Software, right, because we have to keep everything under HIPAA, which makes sure that nothing leaks or breaks. That costs money. That we use a software because it's really important to be able to measure outcomes. We use software to be able to do that. That also costs money, right? And then on the flip side, for our project Adelante, testing fees, supervision fees, licensing fees, that's where it goes. We pay for tutors to help them as well. And so to put someone through our program, if they're with us 2 years, that's a couple thousands of dollars of just supervision and fees that the state requires. And so really a big part of it is money. We just need money to do the work. Also sharing, because the second part is we want people to come through, because when one person gets free and one person is healed, that changes entire generations, right? And so, yeah, it's about the money for the foundation, but bigger picture, send people our way, because if they get free, the next person's free.
I caught that you mentioned you have 2 girls or daughters. Did you mention that you have daughters?
I don't have daughters. I have a dog.
Oh, you have a dog. Okay, I thought I heard daughters, but maybe it was dogs.
Yeah.
Regardless, how do you balance? How do you find that balance between work and what you do? Obviously, you love what you do, and then home life and family, which you made a point to say is so very important to you.
Yeah. I think that's elusive. I don't think balance is a real thing. I wish. Honestly, it really starts with my husband is incredibly supportive. He has, since we started dating, I was like, hey, I'm going places. I'm not messing around. I'm not gonna miss my shot, in the words of Hamilton, right? And so he's always been incredibly supportive and has held a lot of space for me. And so I would love to say that my life is a 40-hour work week and that's it, but it's not, right? What I try to do, what's been helpful for me, is to move through seasons. So, right, summer tends to be slower, so I'm going to naturally work less, and I'm going to take advantage of that, right? So Friday mornings, once it's hot enough, I sit in my pool for at least an hour or two to read. I can't do that all the time, but in that season I can. And I think that's what's been helpful in terms of balance is finding rhythms that feel good and understanding that there are seasons of more work and less work. April, this month was insane. And you can ask my husband, I just have to go home and work. But coming into May, I know it's going to be slower, and I'm going to take advantage of that. And then just making sure I have a few key things that are always serve as self-care. And so that's movement, eating well, making sure I'm sleeping, and scheduling some time that is fun intentionally. So I don't get home and I just watch TV or veg out.
I love what she just said, capture the moment, all of those times. And when we think about the different generations, I'm so envious. I wish I would have known that growing up. And it's amazing. Capture the moment, folks. Capture.
Do we have another question? Yes, ma'am.
Hi. Something that you said about your early career kind of struck me about you being a teacher first, and then pretty quickly you realized it wasn't for you, and you left that, and that seems to be the ultimate self-care is to extricate yourself from something that's not for you or not working for you. So I'm curious, one, how did you come to that realization so quickly, and two, where did you find the courage to leave? Because a lot of women, people in general, find it hard to leave difficult situations if you feel like you're invested in it, whether it's a job or, a relationship or whatever it might be. So can you talk about that?
Well, the first part of this question is easy. The moment I realized teaching wasn't for me was when I was standing in the back of my classroom with about 18 scholars on my carpet, and I have one kid sitting on my foot trying to stab me with a pencil and the other kid trying to escape the room. So that kind of wrapped it up for me really quickly. I just didn't want to manage all that. I could do the one-on-one, I just didn't. And I do want to say this, teachers are incredible, and I think they really are the building blocks of our society. One of my good friends is here, and I met her teaching, and she's amazing, and there's generational change that happens. It just wasn't for me. So that was the kind of the moment when I realized, I don't know that this is worth it. I don't even know if I'm moving in my passion. And so that happened, and then no joke, 2 weeks later, a therapist came into my classroom and we just started chatting, and I was like, oh, that's what I want to do. The second part, I can't say that everything I've left has been easy like that, right? That there was a clear moment. Sometimes it is a growing thing. As I've gotten older, I've realized that I will not let myself go hungry, right? The most of us, even in the hardest of times, we're okay, right? If you think right now in your life about seasons that have been really difficult, you made it, right? And I think that if we can come back to that, I can bet on myself, because at the most fundamental parts of myself, I'm not going to let myself starve, right? That, I'm just not. And if I can just a little bit of that three. I think there's a movie that talks about the 7 seconds of courage, right? That's all it takes. And once you're in motion, bodies that stay in motion or are in motion stay in motion, and that's really what it is. And so it might take a long time to make a decision. That's a normal human thing that we do. But if you bet on yourself, right? If you know that I've made it to this moment and this will not be the hardest thing I have to do that I will ever face, that'll give you a lot of courage for that 7 seconds to make that decision. And then once you're rolling, you're going, right? There isn't necessarily always a looking back. But with that, give yourself so much grace. There's so much grace that has to happen in us making change or deciding to do something different. Give yourself permission to let it be a little bit messy, knowing that you got you. Even if no one else does, you got you. And that's actually a really powerful place to be, even if it doesn't always feel that way.
When you're going, you're rolling. She's got good ones, right? Y'all writing these, I love that.
Hi. Thank you so much for sharing your story. It's so inspiring. I want to, so we work with young students at a summer camp, at a theater camp. And what I learned last year was there's a lot of trauma from our students regarding active shooter drills, families that they lost, family members that they lost due to COVID. And I really feel like our young people really require a lot of therapy. When I asked my students if they were talking to their parents about it, not one of them said yes. And so I've had a chance to talk with some of our elected officials about lobbying for federal funding for students to have the mental health resources that we need. What are your thoughts about that?
Absolutely. Well, I think that, so yes, therapy is a huge part of wellness, and it can be. But what actually brings about healing is relationship, right? And so my encouragement for anyone that works with kids is to do some trauma-informed training. The state has a decent one for free. It's like 45 minutes to kind of understand the tenets of trauma, kind of how that shows up. A lot of times when we're working with kids, we're really good about saying like, that's a bad kid, and saying, instead of saying something like, something bad has happened to that kid, and how can I use this behavior as communication? I think in a perfect world, we would get tons of money for teachers and therapists and whatnot. I think if you guys are familiar with the stats, MHA, Mental Health America, we're number 48 in the nation for mental health services for youth. And I think we're only a few more above for adult services. So Texas is way behind. But understanding Texas culture, I don't know that mental health will be at the forefront. Maybe ever, right? Like, so what do we do with that, right? That's not really, how do we become tools of change, right? How do we, healing isn't like therapy skills. I can ask you CBT questions all day. That's not gonna bring about healing. What actually brings about healing is my story being met with empathy and giving me enough space to be heard in that way. Does it fix everything? No. But when my fears are validated about going to school and that I'm not the only one, that changes stuff, right? And not just emotionally, like the research shows it in our brain. Empathy changes our brain structures. And so, yes, I would love Texas to give money to schools. I don't know, right? Like we all know the world, right? But what I ask the question, how do we become tools of change? How do we do our own work? And even if you're like, hey, I don't want to work with kids, I don't want to do that. Even if you do your own work, your own homework around my own trauma responses, my own self-regulation skills, my own critical thinking skills, that actually impacts the people you interact with. Right? We have this thing called co-regulation. And so the co-regulation is, like even right now, my nervous system and Kim's nervous system is interacting. If she gets anxious, I'm gonna get anxious. And if I get anxious, she's gonna get anxious. And so even the research shows even the smallest of that can bring about healing, right? And so if they're not talking to their parents, how do they talk to you? Right, like how do you, with boundaries obviously, but how can you provide that outlet? Most kids just want to be heard. They don't want advice. They don't want to be told what to do. They just want to say, hey, I'm really scared to go to school, and hear, yeah, that's really scary. We live in a world where that's really scary. What would make you feel better? Like what would help you get to school and know you feel safe? And a lot of times they have their own answers for that. Thank you for the work you're doing with them.
I was just going to say we need to sign up for that, but I will say that employers have an obligation and a responsibility to teach on trauma-informed learning. And when I think about children's and the work we're doing, we have specialists that are in and around our hospitals to help families with that journey, to explain what exactly it is, and then the caregivers, and then our staff and employees. So there are free resources out there, and encouraging folks to do that self-care, which is also self-care, like understanding what that means. That's important, and it just catches on.
Absolutely, and I think trauma is, for a long time, has been like a therapy term, but no one leaves the world without trauma. We all have trauma reactions. That moment when you like are set off and you're like, I don't know what that was about, right? That's actually a trauma response. Yeah. And so to your point is that if you want to be a good employer, be familiar, right? Because then it becomes less about the person and being a bad person and more about the behavior communicating something, a need.
I have a little bit to add on. I could talk about this for days on trauma, but I actually do have a question. And so for personal reasons, trauma is very important to me, and I understand it, and I've read numerous books, and I would say that until you really start to understand how you have to release that from your body, this is why people get cancer, this is why people die. But from a mental health standpoint in the workplace, we talk a lot about bring your genuine self to work. But I'm listening on Audible. It's my new favorite thing. This book right now, and it's Oprah Winfrey and this gentleman, and it's called What Happened to You?
Bruce Perry.
Bruce Perry. And I'm a victim of a very traumatic childhood. And so for me, I was like, my gosh, this book is, you've read it then.
I'm familiar with both their work, with his work.
This book is, I go back and listen to it. Now there's some chapters I'm like, I could do without that. But it would be a good book for you. And the reason is that it makes you stop to think about every single one of us has something.
Yes.
And I'm a much more gracious person in the world now, thinking about why something happens or why someone does something or why someone shows up the way they do. And if we could only do that in our workplace, Johnny Taylor, who I follow on LinkedIn, he's the CEO of SHRM. He talks a lot about civility in the workplace, and it's just such an important topic right now that I think we sort of make into a topic so we can feel good about ourselves, but it's really about the execution. Anyway, that book, though, is so great. I would tell everybody to read it. My 18-year-old's like, please, Mom, don't make me read this. I would love, though, to hear more from you, and congratulations on your award. Would love to hear more from you on the actual programs. When you talked about creating economic mobility for women that are coming into the center, what kind of roles, what kind of skilling are you giving them so that they can go out, and what kind of corporate partnerships do you have that are supporting that?
Okay, so I think you're asking about my nonprofit work. Is that accurate? Because right now I'm doing mainly mental health, but so there was a couple different elements to the nonprofit. So housing. So thinking about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, if you're familiar, the most basic is like shelter, food. Oh my gosh. Yes, thank you. So that's where it started. So on campus we had a grocery store. They each had their own apartment. Everything was always new because of the dignity of a person. And so that's where we started. So when we do any kind of like trauma work in any space, right, we start with the most basic of what does it look like to be stable. You can't work on trauma if you're worried about what you're going to eat for dinner. So that's kind of where we started. From there, our women would meet with advisors, and the advisors would walk them. There was a checklist an assessment that we would give that would tell us where they were lacking in like what we would call like human peopling skills. Okay, so budgeting, cooking, parenting, a little bit of critical thinking skills. And so based on that assessment, we would then kind of divvy out the program to help them in those areas. And so that can kind of get nuanced per person. And then we also had a career and education, who would help them complete school. So whether that was helping them pay for school or even just helping them find their trajectory to a job that our biggest thing was living wage, right? So living wage, if you're not familiar, comes out of MIT. And so they have a calculator that tells you how much you need to make where you're living. And so finding them jobs that made living wage for their family system. Another part of it was mental health services. So we partnered with a counseling center in the community that saw all of our clients that came through for that second part of it, right? As far as corporate sponsors, Kim actually was a part of the nonprofit too.
It's a small world.
Yeah,
like,
it is.
I know you.
Yeah. We did, sometimes it would be like in kind, so like setting up an apartment that cost a couple $100s, because it wasn't scarce. Like they had all the things you would need, right? So sometimes it was be in kind, sometimes it was money to fund programs. So whether that was, for example, my program was student enrichment, so to fund for kids, we ended up building a daycare center, right? Because one of the barriers for women working is not kiddos, but care for kiddos. And so we ended up raising money for that. We also, there was some partnerships. At one point was, Kim, you're gonna
Safety, personal safety.
Yep.
So how do you protect yourself? Like self-sustaining, like after you leave,
Yes.
you know, the location, how do you enrich in that way? Simple things like creating a bank account,
Yep.
getting all of the legalities out of the way.
Yep, and so we would have corporate sponsorships even for that. We had someone who came in and did wills and trust for the women, and so that was all corporate. So we would, if there was anyone that had like really thinking about basic human skills that aren't taught in high school, those were different ways that we could partner with corporate organizations.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if that answered your question, but if there's a follow-up to that. Okay, we can chat after.
What a wonderful conversation. Thank you all for coming today to our forum, Empowering Wellness. Thank you, Kim, for moderating, and Hilda for the amazing work that you're doing. You're so deserving of this award. Congratulations. And yes, please. Thank you for all the work that you're doing and will continue to do, and Kim for being such a supporter of equity and diversity in our community. A few really quick housekeeping notes here that this will be recorded and available. And if you want to learn more about all of our award recipients tonight, you can go to our website, which is TXWFleadership.org. Or in the program you'll have tonight, there's a QR code, and you can use the QR code to learn more. And we will have another session of Leadership Forum starting at 5 o'clock. At 5:45, we will have a reception in the foyer, and then dinner starts at 6:45. Thank you for joining us today. And can we have one more round of applause